Child Survival of the Holocaust with Melissa Mikel. Thank you so much for being with us today, Melissa, and our audience, as well as our technology crew who we could not do this without. I am Dr. Allison Dobrik. I am Associate Professor in the William Patterson University College of Education, and I'm also the Director of the university's Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which since 1994 has been a state-designated teaching center to educate about the Holocaust and other genocides. So today, the center proudly welcomes Melissa Mikel. She is the Director of Education at Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. Her professional training is in education. She has created and implemented programming about the Holocaust, genocide, antisemitism, and racism for students from elementary school through to university, as well as law enforcement personnel and educators. She wrote HarperCollins' Educator's Guide for the Canada Reads 2019 winner by chance alone, a memoir written by Holocaust survivor Max Eisen. She has also published a children's picture book titled The Doll, a child survivor of the Holocaust. Melissa's first master's in the field of education was from the University of Toronto. Her second master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies was completed through Gratz College, where she is currently pursuing her PhD. And to kind of give a little background of the program, the doll, and the book that you're looking at now, Melissa Mikel and Faigie Libman came from two very different worlds. Melissa, a dairy farm in rural Ontario, Canada. Faigie, a child survivor of the Holocaust from Kaunas, Lithuania. Yet their worlds collided with the help of a Shirley Temple doll. In this program, Melissa will share Faigie's story of survival, along with the powerful role played by Faigie's precious doll that brought the two of them together. Melissa?
Thank you so much, Allison. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation to get the chance to share a little bit about this story. If I can just ask to go to the next slide. I thought as I was getting started today, I talk a little bit about the Simon Wiesenthal Center because it does all tie in to the doll and how the story came about. So we are part of the International Simon Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. We operate out of our office in Toronto. Simon Wiesenthal, of course, was a Holocaust survivor, was born in the town of Buchach, part of Poland at the time, part of Ukraine today. Lived, I guess, what you would consider a normal life. Went to school, had friends, family, of course, around, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents. Loved to build. He was a really, whatever he could get his hands on. He used to build with sugar cubes all the time, anything and everything that he could find. And that love for building continued as he went through school, and he decided to pursue a career in architecture and became an architect, actually. Next click, please. As he was going through school, he met Scylla Mueller and they fell in love and got married. And of course planned to start their own family at the time. And the course of their life, however, was shifted tremendously with the start of the Second World War. Living in Poland, they'd heard about what was going on in Germany. Of course, they saw the restrictions that started being placed upon the Jewish population very quickly under Nazi occupation. So Simon and Scylla decided to go into hiding. They felt that that was the best option if they could just wait it out. The hope, of course, was that the war would be short and over quickly. Of course, not being the case, Simon and Scylla were in hiding together. They were eventually reported on and arrested and separated, of course, upon that arrest. They lived, as so many different survivors through unimaginable circumstances. Simon really felt that there's no way that Scylla could have survived after what he had witnessed. He was quite a prolific writer about his experiences during the Holocaust. He told a number of different stories that demonstrated, I guess, his real struggle with survival. One of those stories actually was documented in the book, The Sunflower. He was working as a slave laborer in a hospital. And a nurse came to him and said, "You need to come with me." So, of course, as a slave laborer, went with the nurse. He was taken into the room of a dying Nazi soldier. And this man was Catholic. He was looking for forgiveness for his sins with the hope of, I guess, reaching the afterlife. and asked for a Jew that he would be able to confess his sins to. And so Simon Wiesenthal was selected that day. This man went on to talk about, again, unimaginable crimes that he had committed as his time with the Nazi regime. One of those incidents, of course, being the fact that he had gone into small communities, rounded up the Jewish population, locked them into barns, locked them into synagogues, and burned those buildings to the ground. This dying soldier revealed everything that he had done and asked for forgiveness, and Simon walked out of the room. He didn't give his forgiveness, and he struggled with the fact that he didn't give forgiveness, but he didn't feel that it was his responsibility. It was a crime that was done to other people. It wasn't done to him. How did he have the right to grant forgiveness for something that wasn't done to him? So he documented that story after the war. And this whole concept of forgiveness became the foundation for his book, The Sunflower. He went through 5 different concentration camps during his experience, one of them being Mauthausen, forced through horrendous slave labor. When he was finally liberated, very emaciated, started trying to rebuild his life, trying to look for individuals, wasn't fit enough to travel due to his illness. But did decide to go in and speak to the Allied forces that were in the DP camp where he was being, the displaced persons camp where he was being held. And he offered his assistance. He said, "What can I do?" And really in an effort to kind of brush him off and kind of, I guess, move on and focus on dealing with the end of the war and the humanitarian crisis that they were finding within these camps, it was suggested that he go and write down everything that he remember. And so that's what he did. He started to record the names of commandants in the camps where he was in, the names of guards, things that he had witnessed in the camp, murders of different individuals, deportations, individuals, transports, when they left. He started speaking to other survivors as well and documenting what they remembered from their experiences. And all of that information he gathered and he handed over to the Allied forces. If we can go to the next slide, please. His belief was that there needed to be accountability. There needed to be justice for the crimes that had been committed, and those who had carried them out needed to be held responsible. The international community gave him the title, I guess, of Nazi hunter. And he took that very seriously, but really wanted to make clear that his choices, his actions, the work that he was doing was not retribution. It wasn't about getting even. It was an act of justice. Again, there needed to be accountability for these crimes. I'll take one little step back. I will mention that he, of course, started looking for Scylla after the war as well. Again, not believing that she would have survived. Because of his inability to travel, because of his health, he had a friend who rumors had come that there was a Scylla Wiesenthal who had been found in another Polish town. And so the friend said, "I tell you what, I'll go look and see if it's your wife, because regardless, it's a win-win situation." So Simon Wiesenthal, of course, questioned, "Well, what do you mean a win-win situation?" And his friend said, "Well, if it's Scylla Wiesenthal, your wife, then you're reunited, you're happy, life is good, it's a win. If it's not your wife and she's a beautiful woman, I'll marry her, I'll have a wife, and I'll be happy." It ended up, it was the Scylla Wiesenthal. Simon and Scylla were reunited after the war. Their life wasn't easy, though, after the war. If we can go to the next slide, please. Simon felt that he needed to stay, in order to do the work that he was doing, he needed to stay in what he termed as the heart of the crime scene. He stayed in Austria and ran an office, his Nazi hunting office, out of Vienna, Austria. Scylla wanted more than anything to go to Israel. She felt that that's where they would be safer. They continued to receive threats because of the work that they were doing. Their home was firebombed at one point. His daughter, they did eventually have a daughter. She was escorted to school by a police escort because of the threats to her life. However, this was a drive, a need that Simon needed to be able to carry out One of his very famous lines was that, he believed that when he died, he would go to heaven and he'd have an opportunity to meet the victims of the Holocaust. And he wanted for them to be able to ask him, what did you do with your survival? And his response was going to be, I have never forgotten you. He was responsible for the arrest of over 1,100 Nazi war criminals, and for many years was the only office in the world that continued to pursue Nazi war criminals. Next slide, please. The Simon Wiesenthal Centers do continue that Nazi hunting legacy. So we do have a Nazi hunter that works out of our Jerusalem office, Dr. Ephraim Zuroff, and he continues to pursue Nazi war criminals, contributing to different trials that have continued to happen. The other piece to the legacy that we try to carry on through the centers is, of course, through education. Simon Wiesenthal very much believed that if we were ever going to break the cycle of violence, if we were ever going to change the course of history, then we needed to be able to educate and to learn about these past atrocities in order to make a difference. So a lot of the work that we do, of course, out of our Toronto office is rooted in education and carrying on that education piece. And survivors, of course, are a very important part of that. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. If we can just go to the next slide for a second. I just want to touch base just briefly on Nazi war criminals in Canada. I know that North America in general has a pretty abysmal record in the extradition orders and in pursuing Nazi war criminals for those who moved to North America. I will speak specifically to Canada, as our office is in Canada. Our record is probably the worst of all. We have one Nazi war criminal who has ever been extradited from Canada. This is a photo of Helmut Rocca. He was the commandant of the 9th Fort, which was part of the Countess Ghetto in Lithuania. And he was arrested in the 1980s. If we can click one more time. He was living quite comfortably in North York, a tiny, I guess, community just in the north end of Toronto, living a very unsuspecting life. In fact, when he was actually arrested and media started interviewing neighbors around his home, they just couldn't imagine that he had committed those crimes. After all, he listened to classical music. He was a home painter. Loved to garden. It just didn't align with this image that, of course, came through in media for why he was being arrested. I am going to come back to Helmut Rocca. There's a reason why I mentioned him, but for now, I just want to leave it there, and then I want to shift gears a little bit. So if we can click to the next slide. The work that we do at the center is certainly grounded in education, really focused on providing voices for Holocaust survivors. And I will say that, personally, it's probably one of the greatest privileges is the relationships that I've built with survivors and the opportunities that we've been able to create through education for young people to be able to hear the voices of these survivors who are firsthand witnesses to the atrocities from the Second World War. We have a classroom in our center where we have students that come in for lessons. We go out to schools. We've documented, we've recorded their testimony in video format, lots of different programs in order to try to be able to preserve those voices for future generations. Next slide, please. I do want to highlight as well that we've traveled to sites of the Holocaust. And I just want to mention Max here. I know Allison mentioned that I had written the study guide for Holocaust survivor Max Eisen's testimony by chance alone. This is actually a photo of him. I've had the incredible privilege of traveling with Max to Auschwitz, where he was interned as a 15-year-old on a number of different occasions. And he obviously, provides his testimony as we travel through, has a tremendous impact on, individuals when they hear his testimony. But again, some of the unique programming that comes out of these opportunities is the photo on the bottom of your screen is a photo of a Zoom that Max was part of just last week. And I want to highlight it because this was a once in a lifetime opportunity for Max. He was born in Moldova in Czechoslovakia at the time, and of course was deported as part of the Hungarian transports in 1944. And when He was deported, of course, was taken to Auschwitz, returned immediately following the war with his entire immediate family murdered in Auschwitz, and was refused even a glass of water from his family home. Left and of course came to Canada, has traveled back to Moldova several times, and unfortunately has been the recipient of anti-Semitic treatment upon those returns, the most recent being in 2018. And a couple of weeks ago, we were contacted by a teacher from Moldova who was looking for Max. She had just read his memoir. It's just been released in Slovakian. And she invited Max to come back to virtually to Moldova to present to a class of high school students and to give his testimony. So we try to keep the door open for, incredible moving opportunities, not only for students, but for the survivors themselves. Next slide, please. The other really important piece, I guess, that I want to highlight is the fact that these survivors have pivoted so beautifully to the virtual world. There was concern, of course, with the start of the pandemic that these voices would be silenced, and how are we going to get them into classrooms, and how are we going to, preserve this testimony when already our timeline for in-person survivor testimony is so limited. And we're very fortunate in Toronto, at least, to have survivors who have basically said, tell me what we need to do. We need to keep speaking. We need to keep sharing our testimony. And so there's been an enormous number of programs that have pivoted to the virtual world in order for survivors to continue to speak. Next slide, please. I do want to focus in, however, on this wonderful woman that you see on the slide. So this is Faigie Libman, born Faigie Schmidt. She grew up in Kaunas, Lithuania. And as Allison mentioned in kind of an overview of the program, we have built a very special relationship through a Shirley Temple doll, of all things. And so I want to tell you a little bit about her story and the unique way that we've tried to preserve her story. Next slide, please. Faigie, like I said, grew up in Kaunas, Lithuania. She was born in 1934 to Batya and Faiva Schmidt, her mother and father. They were surrounded by a number of different extended family members as well. Her paternal grandparents lived next door, along with an aunt. Her mother came from a very large family, but really kind of unique circumstances. Her mother was a surgical nurse, and she always talks about her mom as being the general. She was a force to be reckoned with. And her mother was really the parent who was gone most of the time. Faiva, her father, is who she built such a special relationship with. While her mother was away working in the hospitals and being a surgical nurse, her father owned an international bookstore. And so she can remember as a child spending hours walking up and down the aisles of this bookshop, looking through the pages, looking at all of the places that she wanted to travel to, listening to her father speak in different languages. Her mother had an affinity for languages as well, which proved to be very helpful as the war began and progressed. But in addition to the bookstore, her father and her went to the movie theater. They went to plays. They spent tons of time together. And that's actually where she was introduced to Shirley Temple, was by going to the movie theater and, of course, seeing this iconic movie star at the time. Next slide, please. They grew up in quite an affluent family. She remembers going on vacations to visit extended family that lived outside of Kaunas, Lithuania. She remembers going to resort towns. I think the name of the town is Memel, if I recall correctly. But they spent lots of hours enjoying life, spending time together. Next photo, please. She can remember her mother having special outfits made for them. And I know this photo doesn't have them in matching outfits, but that's really one memory that stands out for her, is that they always had matching outfits that were made. So mother and daughter dressed together, which again, she always laughs at because, her mother was the general and she didn't, before the war, feel really close to her. It was more her father. And yet they had all of these outfits that, that matched at the same time. Next slide, please. Some of her mother's family had actually moved to New York, to South Africa, and to Canada before the war started. And so on her 5th birthday in the summer of 1939, Faigie had a very special package that arrived on her doorstep. And when she opened it, inside was a Shirley Temple doll. So this doll had been sent by an aunt and uncle who lived in New Rochelle, New York, and I guess had heard about her love of Shirley Temple and sent her this precious doll. And for Faigie, this was everything. No one else in her friend circle had a Shirley Temple doll. So she always talks about becoming the hit of the neighborhood by having this doll. And Shirley went everywhere with her. She can remember taking her to the hospital to visit her mom, of course, to the International Bookshop, going out to parks and playing with this doll with her friends everywhere. Everywhere Faigie went, Shirley went with her as well. The war in Lithuania, and again, from a child's perspective, from Faigie's perspective, didn't begin in her mind until 1941. She knew that there were soldiers on the street. They were initially occupied by the Russians. So she remembers the uniform, she remembers the boots, but she doesn't remember it really impacting her personal family's life. Her father continued to own the bookshop. He did not have his business confiscated. And her mother continued to work as a surgical nurse. Her mother, as I mentioned, had an affinity for languages and spoke Russian. So she was a real asset to have in the hospital at that time because she was able to translate. So life really continued on for Faigie in some form of relative normalcy until 1941, when the occupying forces became the Nazis and with the German invasion. And things changed pretty quickly at that point. She doesn't remember the entire process. She just remembers that there was a notice that was posted in town saying that they had to pack up their belongings and they had to move to a ghetto. And she can remember her mom, flurrying around the house, packing things up, trying to determine what they were going to take with them because they were limited in what they were able to take. She remembers her mom packing her or dressing her in multiple layers of clothing as well, and some of her really fancy outfits as well, and not realizing at the time that those became bartering pieces down the road in the ghetto when things continued to worsen. But her mother dressed her in layers. The one thing her mom did say, though, to her was she could take one thing with her when she left the house. And so Faigie said there was really no question her Shirley Temple doll was going with her. So she wrapped her up in a silk pillowcase and carried her with her into the ghetto. Next slide, please. Life in the ghetto, she remembers being difficult, but again, as a young child, she was 7 years old. A number of her friends went into the ghetto with her. Her parents were gone much of the day, especially her mother. Her mother was taken out on work details, again, as a surgical nurse, had a benefit certainly to offer those work details that went out. Her father was trying to find work, but he would spend time with them as well. She had her grandparents, they were all living in the same space together. So as a 7-year-old, it was a different circumstance, but there was still some normalcy to her. She also had her Shirley Temple doll. And she can remember spending days, out on the streets with that doll and continuing kind of that similar, I guess, childhood life that she had had outside of the ghetto. She continued to be very protected from the violence and the abuse that was going on around her. There were days where her mother would tell her that she needed to go to the hospital with her, wherever the work detail was going. And Faigie said she hated those days because it meant having to get up so early in the morning to walk so far and then to have to turn around and come back at the end of the day. And it was during those days where she actually was witness to some of the brutality, because of course on the work detail, you had the guards who were meting out punishments for the slightest infractions. So those were things that she really didn't enjoy. But of course, her mother being the general, if she said you needed to go, she got up to go. I should mention as well that Faigie's motto in life is "It will be good." It's how she lived her life as a young child. It's how she continues to live her life today. But she can also point out certain days in her memory when it wasn't good. And one of those days was a work detail day where her mother took her with her outside of the camp. She doesn't know how much her mom knew that, was actually going on. In all likelihood, her mother knew that rumors had been spreading about children being rounded up and taken out of the ghettos. So she probably did have an idea of what was going on. Anyway, this one particular day, her mother, woke her up early in the morning, said, "You're coming with me." And when they returned later that day, all of the children were gone. It had been, you can actually research it today. It's called the Kinder Action. The elderly in the ghetto that were left back from the work details that day, along with all of the children, had been rounded up and taken away. Of course, all they knew was that they disappeared, but they had all been murdered. And for Faigie, all of her friends were gone. Her grandmother had been taken away that day. That was a day that wasn't good. And so the only thing that she knew to do was to take her doll, her Shirley Temple doll, and she threw it to the ground. And of course, it broke into a million different pieces. From that day on, things were very difficult. She can remember being marched with her family. She said at different times, you were called to line up and to be counted, to be selected, to be sorted. And on this one particular day, she remembers with her family having to walk past a man who was standing on a mound of dirt. He was wearing a white glove, and with the flip of his wrist was simply dividing right to left, right to left. She was able to stay with her family that day. She stayed, her mother and her father, they were selected to the right. Her grandfather and her aunt were selected in a different direction. And as she always says, her side was good, their side was bad. This particular action is referred to as the Great Action at the Ninth Fort. And her grandfather and her aunt were two of almost 10,000 Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered in one day at the Ninth Fort. All of these actions, started to compound and to build up, and she started to become very aware of the realities, of course, that they were facing. They were in the ghetto for 3 years. 1944 is when she was separated from her father. They were placed on a train. Her father ended up being sent to Dachau. Faigie and her mother were sent to Stutthof. They arrived in Stutthof, and, again, she never spoke with her mother about, whether this was information she knew, whether it was just by chance that, she made these choices. But the general told her when they went to get registered within the camp, and of course, keeping in mind that this is nearing the end of the war, so the procedures of actually interning prisoners into the camp were not quite as stringent, and of course, dependent on what part of Eastern Europe they were being interned in. In Faigie's case in Stutthof, her mother told her when they went through not to say a thing. And again, Faigie said, if the general spoke, you listen to what she said. And so when they went through the processing of internment at the camp, her mom told the guard that she was 12 years old instead of 10 years old, because of course 12 years old meant that you were able to work. And when they went through the showering process, of course, but they also were not given striped uniforms to wear. They chose clothing from a mound of clothing. And when her mother chose clothing for her, she chose a pair of shoes that had a little bit of a heel on it. She always says too that her mother chose some undergarments and stuffed her in the right places so that she looked a little bit older, and they were processed into the camp. So as a 10-year-old child, Faigie was interned in Stutthof. They ended up going through 3 different camps in their experience. Faigie very proudly likes to share that she was an excellent trench digger, and as a matter of fact, earned extra rations because of her incredible trench building during that time. Next slide, please. 1945, Batya, Faigie's mother, and herself were liberated from Stutthof. They were taken out, they were taken on a death march. They'd left Stutthof on a death march and were liberated by the Russian army as the march was progressing. Of course, they started looking for family members, particularly, of course, Faiva, Faigie's father. And this is the second day that Faigie will point to as a day that was not good. And that was the day that she found out that her father had not survived. He actually ended up being executed by a guard in Dachau 1 week before Faigie and Batia were liberated on the death march. Faiva gave up, Faigie said. She spoke to a friend that had been with him in the camp at the time. He had refused to go on the death march because he felt that there was no way that Faigie could have survived. And she was so precious to him, the friend said that he just gave up. And so Faigie said that day of learning that her father hadn't survived was probably the most devastating day of her life. So where do you go from here? What do you do? Faigie and Batia ended up in Austria in a displaced persons camp, and of course started to look for where they could go. They found that all of their family members living in Lithuania with them at the time had been murdered in the Holocaust. And so they started looking to family outside of Europe to see where they could go. And it ended up that an aunt of Faigie's who lived in Montreal was able to sponsor them. And in 1948, Faigie and Batia came to Canada and built their life here. Next slide, please. She met her husband, Benny. I just laugh because she always, when she shows the picture of herself with her husband in their wedding picture, she always says how the bridegroom was more handsome than the bride. They built a life in Montreal. They eventually left Montreal due to a crisis that was happening in the 1970s. Military tanks were out on the street again, and there was fear, of course, seeing the tanks, and they decided they weren't going to wait around the way that they did the first time. And so Benny, of course, her husband was a survivor as well. So they packed up their kids. Next slide, please. And they moved to Toronto. Faigie initially went through school to become an accountant. And once she had kids and started volunteering in their classrooms, one of the teachers said, you've really missed your calling. And so Faigie decided to go back to school and to become a junior kindergarten teacher. And she has the greatest love for anyone that chooses teaching as a profession. And that's what she absolutely loved doing. In fact, to the point where she never missed a day of junior kindergarten until the 1980s. Next slide, please. Faigie, you'll remember this headline from the very start of our presentation where I was speaking about Helmut Rocca. Faigie lived in the north end of Toronto, and on this very fateful day in 1982, she came home and opened the newspaper to read this headline, "Toronto man arrested as German war crimes suspect." And she said she called the school immediately where she taught and said she won't be in the next day, closed the curtains, and closed herself, or tried to close herself off from the world. Why? This man who was arrested, Helmut Rocca, who we saw the photo of at the beginning of the presentation, he was that man that stood on the mound in 1941 when Faigie and her family walked by, and he very carelessly flicked his wrist from right to left, choosing who would live and who wouldn't live. He was responsible for the murder of her grandfather and the murder of her aunt, along with almost 10,000 other Jewish men, women, and children. This man lived 2 blocks away from Faigie in Toronto. And for her, from the time of liberation until 1982, she never spoke about the war. She didn't want her children to carry the weight of what her experiences were. She didn't want to scare them. She didn't want to relive those painful memories in that past. And she started speaking to fellow survivors that she knew as well. And one person in particular, when they were talking about the extradition order of Helmut Rocca, one person said to her, "Where were you? We needed you. We needed your testimony. We needed this information in order to gather evidence to make this extradition order happen." And so for Faigie, that became her motivation to start speaking. And again, as she says, once she started speaking, you couldn't shut her up. And she has continued for the last 30 years to tell her story. Next slide, please. And this is, next slide, please. this is the next, I guess this is how our stories collided. I started working for the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center in 2008, and Faigie was one of the first survivors that I'd heard. I grew up in rural Ontario on a dairy farm, probably just about as far removed from Holocaust and genocide as you can imagine. And yet it's always been something that's kind of been an intrinsic calling that this is something I need to do. I take very seriously listening to the testimonies of survivors and the weight of that responsibility to be able to carry those testimonies forward. So Faigie was one of the first survivors I heard speak, and she was speaking to a classroom of students. And she, of course, was talking about her Shirley Temple doll. And she got to the point, of course, where she smashed the doll. And when she was saying that, I was thinking she was 8 years old at the time. And myself at 8 years old, and I realize again, we're two different worlds apart, but at 8 years old, my mom was a doll maker. I had a doll for every Christmas, for every birthday, for every event you could imagine. And at 8 years old, I was so tired of dolls, I didn't want to see another one. There was a little bit of guilt, I guess, when I listened to, Faigie, and imagining this child who lost everything and her one prized possession was gone as well. So I came home that night and I called my mom, as we do, and I said, "You've got to hear this story." And I guess just as fate would have it, just that week, my mom had actually gone to purchase some doll molds. She makes porcelain dolls from scratch. And as she was leaving, she makes antique reproductions. So dolls, German, French dolls from the 1800s. Shirley Temple is considered a modern doll. As mom was leaving, this woman said to her, "I've got a Shirley Temple mold. Will you take it?" And mom said, "No, no, no, I don't make that type of doll." Anyway, regardless, mom left with a Shirley Temple mold that day. That had just happened earlier that week. So as I guess I've done my whole life, I said, "Well, mom, there's only one thing you can do." And of course, that one thing was to make Faigie a new Shirley Temple doll. So the only condition on the making of this doll was that Faigie had to be comfortable with it. And I called her up and asked if she would be okay, whether it would, bring back too many painful memories. And absolutely not. She said she, would give anything to have a Shirley Temple doll. And so I think it was in 2008, 2009, Faigie has a brand new Shirley Temple doll, and Shirley travels all across Canada with Faigie. I don't think she's made an international travel just yet, but she does go everywhere with her. And actually, I think we do have one more slide, Allison, if you can just go one more. That's actually obviously the heart of this book that was written. Faigie's health has been failing in the last little bit. She actually had a pretty tremendous fall last October and broke her hip, and she had always wanted her own book. And so we decided that a colleague of mine who's an incredible artist, we decided that we would self-publish a book so that she would have her own book. And that's where the doll, A Child's Survival of the Holocaust, came from. It's an incredible privilege to be able to witness these stories, to share in, I guess, the emotional part of learning about the past families that have been lost, the memories that have stayed with these survivors for so many years. It is a privilege to be trusted, I guess, with those memories and to carry those memories forward. And whether it's through, the work that we do in hunting down Nazi war criminals and seeking justice, whether it's providing a platform for survivors to speak in recorded video, in-person classroom visits, traveling to sites of the Holocaust so that they can stand on the grounds and talk about their past, but also to celebrate in their survival, whether it's through stories like the doll, where these memories will be carried forward. All of these pieces are such important aspects of Holocaust education, and it's a privilege to be a part of it. And it's also an incredible privilege to be asked to speak about it. So thank you for the invitation today to be able to speak about Faigie, to be able to share a little bit about the work that we do at the Wiesenthal Center. And certainly if there's any questions, I think I finished a little bit early, Allison, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
No, you finished perfectly, and that it
Okay.
was really a wonderful presentation. I missed the round of applause that should be going on right now because it's like we can't really do that on Zoom.
No.
Um, but thank you so much. And yeah, the audience, if you don't mind, please either put your questions in the Q&A. You can type them in there and we can read them, or you can do the raising hand, not like your actual hand, but the raising hand feature on Zoom, and they can unmute you and you can ask the questions yourself if you'd like. So I will
Hi,
open.
Allison, it's Pete. I have Laura with her hand raised.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to allow her to talk.
Thank you, Pete.
And go ahead, Laura, you need to unmute your mic and then you could speak.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dobrik, so much. And thank you, Melissa Mikel, so much. So when you were making the book, we have students here that make versions of art and attempt illustrations. Were you an artist before that?
Oh, I like to think I'm an artist. So the illustrations were actually drawn by a colleague of mine that actually knows Faigie really well as well. She's an incredible artist. So all of the paintings were done. They're all watercolor paintings with a little bit of mixed medium. I think she's got a few other mediums that she used within the artwork as well. But they're at the heart of it. They're watercolors. And so she is an incredible artist. I would love to be able to create the illustrations, but this wasn't the project for me to start doing that on. So
No, just real quickly, but you worked together on figuring out which episodes you wanted to illustrate.
Ooh, we did. We very much did. So we knew what we wanted to highlight. So it was, we were very strategic in what we chose to illustrate. We were also very strategic in how we wanted to depict certain pieces. So as a children's picture book, obviously, we have to be cautious with the way that we're presenting some of the material. We also know, with a background in teaching as well, that often when you're presenting Holocaust, that sometimes there's a fascination on swastikas or, symbols of the Nazi era. So we also wanted to be very strategic in how we approach those representations. We didn't want the focus to be on Hitler. We didn't want the focus to be on the Nazis. The focus was on Faigie and her doll. So we have one page, we have several pages with soldiers, but again, they're very, it's not identifiable there's no symbols on them. We have one page that does talk about the rise of Hitler. But again, he's featureless, and we were very strategic and selective in how we depicted that. So
Thank you. Thank you so much.
you're welcome. Thank you.
We have a question in the Q&A, which thanks you for the great presentation, and also wanted to know whether Faigie's children continue to educate the world or plan to when she cannot.
It's a great question. So she has a granddaughter, actually. It's more kind of the grandchildren, I guess, generation. Her granddaughter works for one of the Jewish organizations in Toronto and has very much carried on that legacy. I think that that's a common pattern that we see. I won't say that it's consistent because I know I work with a lot of second generation family members of survivors, but a significant number, it's the third generation that you see kind of carrying on their grandparents' story. I know that Faigie's granddaughter went with her on March of the Living, so the annual trek that travels through Poland and then on to Israel to learn about the history. Faigie, of course, has been a survivor that's accompanied those trips. Oh gosh, I don't know how many times she's gone now, but for well over 2 decades, she's been a part of that journey. Max Eisen, who I spoke about at the beginning as well. It was his granddaughter actually that asked him to go on March of the Living and to be a survivor that, again, has turned into, a dedicated commitment to Holocaust education. So in a lot of my experiences with the survivors I worked with, it's a lot of the grandchildren that have carried that legacy on. So.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions too, but I'm waiting for the audience if they wanted to give them a turn too. I found it so interesting how you talked about providing a voice for Holocaust survivors. Of course, they have their own voice, but they may, need that help or that listening to know like what angle and what, like how to express their legacy. And I just want to know if you had further comments on that. Like, this is so based on one concrete, experience, and yet from that point, it expresses her whole entire life story and who she is. And I thought that was really beautiful. I wonder if you could comment on that further.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a huge responsibility, right? When you have someone that comes and wants to share their testimony. And, again, I always think for myself, I'm so far removed. Like I always want to make sure that we're doing justice to their story and that it is their voices that are coming out and it's not our persuasion. So, a number of the survivors have been giving their testimony for a number of years. So, we've, as far as, helping guide any of those presentations, it's offering feedback on, certain stories and, what to try to focus and to try to flesh out a little bit more detail, because they are, the survivors look at their stories as well. It's just my experience. And it's like, oh, but you don't understand, like it's the fact that you're courageous enough to share these experiences, right? So it's in some of the survivors, it's very much just kind of fleshing out a little bit more and asking a few pointed questions to kind of help develop the presentation a little bit. Interestingly, we've had probably over the last 5 years, survivors who have never told their story before, who have started to reach the age where they've decided it's time and they don't want, it's not only their story, I think that's the other interesting piece. They don't want their story to be lost in history, but they also are very driven by preserving the names of people whose lives were taken. And once they go, then those names are gone as well. So that's been a really interesting process as well, is helping them to develop their presentation and their story through that presentation, while giving recognition and time to those individuals that they lost as well. Kids are so interested, when you're talking to a survivor, to learn about their personal piece. So it's finding that balance between getting that personal piece out, but then giving voice to those others that were lost as well. We had someone just last year, and actually, unfortunately, the pandemic has slowed us down. We're just starting to talk about how we can get this documented, but there's a gentleman from Western Canada. He's 99 years old. He has very purposefully never told his story, didn't want to weigh any of his family down. He has decided that it's time. So, and not only is he willing, like he wants to be recorded. So we're in the process of doing research. We've done kind of the preliminary research, I guess, and through, the International Tracing Service, through United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, the number of resources that are out there and the digitization of these collections. We've been sending files of documents that the family didn't know existed, like the not transit papers, identity cards, like with photos attached to them, and pieces of their family history that they didn't know exist. So, when you, I guess every once in a while we're asked that question, why are you still studying Holocaust? Like what's the relevance still today? When you look at, the discoveries, I guess, that are still coming, the connections that are still being made, there's so much still to learn. Aside from it's such an important topic as well, but certainly one of the aspects of why it's still important.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, if there are no further audience questions, that's great. Melissa, it was a wonderful presentation and we are just more than honored to have been able to hear it. So thank you so much for coming to William Patterson. I hope we can welcome you here. That's William Patterson, beautiful building in the background, one of our nicest. We have a beautiful campus, and I hope to be able to welcome you there too.
Oh, I look forward to the day we can meet in person very much. So
I mean,
thank you so
seriously.
much for the invitation.
Of course. Thank you. And thank you everyone so much for coming. Wonderful program in commemoration of Yom HaShoah, which was yesterday. Just thank you so much, and everyone have a wonderful day, wonderful weekend. Thank
Thank
you. Bye-bye.
you.